behind you, and where do you see yourself heading?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm glad that it's over, to tell you the truth. I think that it was a very hectic time for me during the whole course of the political season and the presidential campaign. It meant spending a lot of time away from home, among other things, and that settled down somewhat now, gotten a little bit more back to normal. I think we accomplished something very important in terms of carrying a message to people around the country of the need to take seriously the nation's moral crisis and to understand that a lot of our problems are rooted in that. That was the message I carried, and I think a lot of people responded well to it. So it did have the effect of encouraging me that there's a lot of hope for this country and a lot of people in it who want to do the right thing.
What are the commitments that you see yourself mainly immersed in at this point in your life?
Oh, I think first and foremost, when you have a family and 3 children, your commitment is to make sure they're all taken care of properly, and that the children are going to grow up to be the kind of good folks I would like them to be, believing in God and in a sense of their own need to make a contribution that's worth something in this life. I'm also very much involved now in trying to continue to wake people up in terms of dealing with what I think is a real crisis in American life and liberty right now. The need to address the issues of a deteriorating character that I think is afflicting the American people due to a loss of a real understanding of what freedom is about. We're defining it in ways that are very self-destructive and licentious, and we need to get back to something that's a more disciplined and based in a sense of respect for our Creator, who is the source of our rights. And I also am trying to spend a lot of time and specifically working with people on the pro-life movement, because I think that's a key issue in our time, helping folks to raise money and do things that will promote that cause.
What particularly can be done in the home to instill a sense of character, a sense of virtue in our children?
Oh, I think the answer to that is actually 2 things that are simple to say and somewhat harder to do when you think about it in a sincere way. The first thing is pray a lot, and the second is example. I think it's an old truism that the real root of moral education is example, but when you deal with your children, you realize it more than any other time. And the way I realized it was that your children are like a mirror, but they're a funhouse mirror. And things about you that you have ceased to notice turn up in them writ large, you know, take gestures, ways of speaking, characteristics of one kind or another. And I think it's partly because for a time in your children's life, you are the biggest thing there is. And they're very intent on you, and they're looking at you very hard, and they're responding to who you are and what you do and how you feel and what you communicate. And so, of course, you're basically having a tremendous impact, an almost frightening impact on their lives and on their characters and on their knowledge of the world. And so that old saying that you're teaching by example and leading by example, where your children are concerned, is absolutely true. And you can lecture to them, and you can talk to them, and you can try in other ways to get them to read the Bible and understand things like that. But the way that they're really learning, both especially in the area of morals and in the area of faith and the relationship with God, is they're learning from you.
Sure. How can parents respond to that modeling effect when society presents a different model? There's this internal influence in the home from the parents, and we can do the best we can as parents. But what about the other image that society gives our children? How can we defend against that?
Well, you know, I think that's a hard thing to do these days, because a lot of the work you're trying to do, I think of it like the who was it, Penelope in the Odyssey, and she would weave during the day, and then at night she'd go in and undo it, so she would have to do the same job over again the next day. And she had a good reason for doing that, but unfortunately I think we have a lot of forces in American life these days who are unweaving the tapestry that we're trying to weave in the lives of our children. And that's true of the schools. It's certainly true of the entertainment media and so forth. Everything is coming at them, I feel, with a philosophy that puts them at the center of the world, indulging their passions and treating everybody else as if they were just the instruments of those passions, which in some ways is the essence of evil when you're dealing with other human beings. And to counteract that, I think you first of all have to have the opposite prevailing in your own life and in your own home. So that the sense that human beings are to be valued as God-created ends in themselves, to be respected because of what He has endowed them with, that's something you have to show in your attitude toward your children. And I think that what they learn from you in that respect actually is stronger than what they learn from the world. Because in a sense, the attachment they have to you is one that comes first of necessity and want, and second, quite frankly, of love. I mean, the experience I have is that, almost in spite of themselves, your children love you. And if you ask them to explain why this is so, they wouldn't be able to do it, because there are certainly times when they don't like you very much. But nonetheless, they're very attached to you and they want to please you. And they want to please you more than they want to please anybody else in the world, at least during the formative early years of their lives. And that means that during those years you have to be working very hard to try to be the right kind of person, send the right kind of messages, and develop with them the kind of relationship that will speak louder than the world's words about the real meaning of things like love and freedom.
You touched on the area of prayer earlier, and there are a lot of kids that are, well, there are a lot of us. Does God really hear a kid? Can a kid actually turn to God and seek practical answers to where his life's going to go?
Well, two things are true. First of all, I think it's very important to teach children that they are not the center of the universe. I think it's very important to teach children that God is the center of the universe and that we are just kind of His satellites or something like that. And occasionally it's good to teach them that they are just your satellites. You know what I mean? I mean, the notion somehow that you let children grow up in this belief that the world exists for their sake, it's a falsehood, first of all. It's a deception that they will blame you for when they encounter the real world. So why foist it off on them? You know, instead, try to teach them the world as it is. And the world as it is, the center, the sun, is not us. And if we think that it is us, we end up being, I think, sadly lost and mistaken. So it's good to let children realize that they're not always the center of things. But I think it's also good, and the best source here is just going to be the Gospels and the Scripture and the truth that Christ spoke. He was very clear, even on ascribing maybe a little special line to God on the part of children, you know. You want to introduce them to this idea gradually so it doesn't go to their head, but he does suggest that God listens with a special ear to the prayers of children. And that how we, other people in the world, are relating to children, both in the actual physical sense and in the spiritual sense of the word children, is going to be a very strong determinant of God's attitude toward us. So I think you can teach children that truth simply by, at some point, introducing them to the lessons that Christ teaches in His words and in His life.
Perhaps one of the most critical times is when that child makes his way or her way through high school and into college and starts facing bigger questions such as, what is my purpose in life? What does God want from me? Where am I going? Far bigger than what should I major in or what's my career. How can that child and how can that home environment help answer those questions?
Well, you know, I don't want to pretend that I can answer that question yet, because I am a parent right now, and my eldest is 14, so I'm still trying to navigate these rather difficult seas myself. Anything I say is speculation. and because I haven't navigated them successfully yet, I don't know whether I'm going to reach my goal or the ship's going to be wrecked. It's always possible. And one of the things that I have to say is that parenting has, you know, among other things in life, is one of those things that is a truly humbling experience. And it's the one that has most often driven me to my knees, quite literally, in the realization that I don't know what I'm doing. I hope God does. So you really can't, I really can't answer the question you raised with any sure confidence. But I do think, how can I put this? Sometimes it's not so important that you help people to get the right answer, because you can't get it for them. It is just important that they understand how to ask the right questions. And in moral things, I think today everybody in this society is encouraged to ask the wrong question. They are encouraged to ask the question, what do I want? What fulfills me? What will get what I want? How will I be satisfied? To define happiness as if it were all about their selfish satisfaction. So I think you make a great breakthrough with not just children, but with everybody, when we finally reach the point where we've stopped asking what we want and we start asking what God wants. That's a tremendous breakthrough. And we start identifying our satisfaction and our happiness and our success with our ability to ascertain and do what God wants us to do. And to say that not in some high-flown way, but in something, it's just a kind of ordinary way. We are His creatures, and that being the case, we have to try to understand what His purpose was. If you go out and somebody builds a house, or they build a car, or they put a bridge in, and you're trying to understand the house or the car or the bridge, one of the things you're going to ask is, well, why did you build this house? Who is it for? What were they going to do here? How many people were going to live here? You're asking about their intentions. You're asking about the plans of those who created the house, the plans of the people who built the bridge or put the car together. In the context of their plan, of their intention, you can have a better understanding of why the house was put together the way it was and how you can best make use of the house. Well, I think that's the same thing, that the same thing is true of the way that we relate to God. He's our creator. And if we want to know about ourselves in the truest sense and about what we are for and what we ought to do, then we ought to be asking a question. What was His idea? What was His plan? What did He have in mind? And we also need to keep in mind that thankfully He hasn't left us without any guideposts in that respect. We have, in the first instance, of course, parents, but we also have the example of His Son, who came down here to give us a direct word from on high about how these things should be done, and to do it not just in His speech, but in His deed. And to show us that even for the Son of God, life wasn't just about what He wanted, which I think is one of the most important lessons of the life of Jesus Christ. You know, when you finally realize that push comes to shove, He was no different than you or me. He did not particularly like the idea of being nailed to a cross and all of that. But He had to consult and realize, not my will, but thine be done. He even had His moment when He confronted that truth, that His purpose was the Father's purpose, and that in fulfilling that purpose, he was in fact fulfilling His being. And that lesson, which was there for one who could at any point have freed himself from the constraints of our nature, done what he pleased, I think is certainly there for us as creatures of God, constrained by the nature that He endowed us with, who therefore are under even greater necessity of consulting His plan when we're trying to figure out who we are and what we're going to do. So I think maybe the most important thing is to get that right question asked, and to get folks to realize that, in a sense, it is not your will and your kind of needs and your wants that are to be fulfilled, but God's. And by doing that, you will actually come to understand your needs and your wants and your happiness better than you can without that.
Young people are not asking themselves at this point, I want to be what God wants me to be. You've said many times, and I think it's right on target, be what God wants you to be. Why aren't young people asking that question?
Well, I guess I'm not quite willing to believe that all young people are not, or that many young people are not. I think some young people are. I can't believe, and I see even in my own children and others, that in spite of this society, there is a natural tendency for young people to begin to ask the big questions. And even before they ask them, to feel how important they are, and that there is something missing if those answers aren't there. So I think there is in each and every one of us a tendency, if you like, to look for the answer to those questions, to try to formulate them somehow. But it's not encouraged in our society. One of the things that I think is hurtful about the world we live in is that we live in a world in which people act as if they figured out all the mysteries. All the mysteries of human life have been resolved. We know what we're dealing with. when we deal with life, with sex, with passion, with whatever. There was a time in human sort of history when human beings were a little humbler about themselves. Our science and the advances in our understanding about certain material things have actually led us to the conclusion that we know it all, and that there are no questions, the answers to which lie beyond our imagining and beyond our ability to kind of put things down in some scientific formula. And that leads, I think, to this assumption that you already know about everything, and therefore you know what you want. You know, you want pleasure, you want a good, fulfilling sex life, you want, you know, to have enough money, you want to have fun, this and that. And all the mysteries having been resolved, it's simply a question of how much of those good things are you going to get. But at some point, I think, most of us, and this starts very young, start to realize that there is in our lives something that goes beyond these sort of obvious things they're telling us are the answers. We long for something that they cannot satisfy. We don't know what it is, but I think one of the reasons young people get so much involved in music, for instance, very often they'll reach a stage in life when it just sort of dominates everything, is because music actually speaks to that part of us which knows that there is more to life than the things that we have in it. It wakes up in us that sense that there is a beauty we can't quite express, but it's still real. There is a nobility we can't quite visualize, but we know it's there. You know, and that thing, that truth, which is there but just out of our reach. And in that sense, I think we can encourage that part of them that asks the questions, that seeks the answers, and that still, I think, questions whether these easy answers that are provided by our society and our environment are the right ones. I think that's also why kids are more idealistic sometimes. You know, they're liable to latch on to political idealism, to, you know, be prey to all kinds of movements that will encourage them to fancy themselves the heroic saviors of the world. This can be unrealistic sometimes, but it's an impulse which suggests that we are all of us born with a desire to do the will of God, that we know that He's greater than we are, and we are always therefore seeking the causes that will confirm in us our ability to satisfy Him.
Is that part of your own approach to making decisions about where God might be calling you, to seek God's counsel and advice, whether it's something in your family or something in your professional life?
To seek it, and also, I guess, to accept it. Because in the end, sometimes seeking can be a kind of thing where you're sort of filled with a question and you go out and look for the answer, right? Sometimes, though, seeking can just be an openness to a truth that you haven't even been able to formulate well enough to ask the question. Very often in our lives, the question about what we should do with ourselves is a question like that. And being willing, being open to the possibilities God puts before us, being willing to accept them. And I guess that's how my life has been. I haven't known quite often, or at least could not have predicted for the most part, where I would end up at any given time. But some of the most important things that have occurred in my life have happened simply because at some point I was walking down the road, things started to happen, and I was finally confronted with the question, am I going to accept what God apparently wants me to do, or am I going to try to do something else? And so that willingness to be open to that moment and to accept it when it comes, and maybe even give up things that you thought were the right things to do, you know, because we all go through life with preconceptions, the things we really want and think are the right things. I think that's part of it. So it's a seeking, but it's a seeking that involves accepting rather than just imposing our question on things.
I'm intrigued also by something you mentioned earlier, and that's this image of signposts along the way as markers revealing God's will. Tell me about those signposts in your life and how they helped you.
Oh, I think that there are some obvious ones. I mean, the first ones, in a sense, are your parents. They lead you to others, which I at least have found in my faith. in terms of some of the truths that have come to me through my Catholic faith, through things that have been placed here for our understanding and for our guidance by God, and which as we grow older we learn to make better use of, including things like going to church and so forth. At first it can seem like simply a burden. After a while you begin to realize that it's actually there for your good. It's there because what you are doing there and participating in there is part of what helps you to grow. Those kinds of things, I think, are signposts. But you also meet signposts in the people that you encounter along the way. Teachers, who have been very important to me at various times, including one professor I met in college named Alan Bloom, who was, I think, an important influence in my life, partly because even though I can't say I always agreed with him or his approach to life, I do think he understood the significance of moral things as well or better than anybody I've ever known. Significance in the terms of public life and in terms of social life and so forth. And that was very important. You know, and you also encounter people along the way, because we think of signposts as good things, right? But there are also signs that kind of warn you away from things. And those signs can be useful too, the signs that say stop, danger, no good whatsoever. And I think certainly all of us have encountered people like that in our lives, whom we remember as the folks we finally learned to avoid, or were heartily glad that we did finally understand enough to turn away from that example. And we grew up with, I, for instance, started out in life with the idea that I was going to go quickly through college and get out and become a lawyer and then jump with both feet into, you know, some public or political career and go off. And then I met Alan Bloom and I started taking political philosophy seriously and so forth and so on, and it turned out to be, you know, vastly better than what the alternative might have been, even though in the end, many years later, it came around to the point where I did get involved in politics and so forth and so on, but not by the method I thought. So I think that people, by and large, are important signposts too. So the combination of the signposts that God has put in our way, signposts which are there in our faith, in our religion, in the scriptures, you know, at times when in your life you are dealing with significant issues, and you spend time, you know, reading the scriptures, you hear the gospel in church, and you are struck by the fact that a word that God has spoken to everyone especially applies to you today. And that becomes for you a sign along the way that this is something you need to explore, because the truth that will help to inform what you have to do is going to be in your ability to really understand what God's word meant in that moment. I think that's an important signpost as well.
Back in high school auto shop, I remember an instructor telling me the right tool for the right job. And it sounds like in your discussion of signposts, there are good tools and there are bad tools out there on the workbench of life. Is that what you're saying? That there are some good tools to look for, but also some other tools that will lead us astray from God's will?
Well, that's right. And I think that's why I say that there are signs that point in the right direction and some signs that warn us against the wrong direction. And we have to be aware of and able to kind of discern both things along the way. I believe that parents and church and scripture are put there for us to help us develop that discernment. And sometimes I think, especially when you're young, you can look upon these institutional things as if they're just there somehow to impose on you. As you go along, I think, you become grateful in life that you're not having to do it all by yourself, that you're not having every stage of the way to reinvent the wisdom that is needed in order to get through life. Because if we had to do that, we wouldn't make it. And I am grateful that God is a good God, and that in point of fact, He went even so far as to send His Son down here to make sure that we would get the instructions before it was too late, you know.
You are obviously living out in your life when you knew God was calling you to the vocation of marriage, and subsequently to marry the woman you're married to.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if it works this way for everybody, but I think those 2 points coincided. I think I got called to marriage when I found a person who, I was drawn to marry. And I think along the way, too, because I have found that being married is a true voyage of discovery. That you think you know what you're doing, and you don't. That is to say, people say, I'm saying it right now, and there are people out there who are listening who are not married. They hear the word marriage and think they know what I mean. I would like to tell them right now that they have no idea whatsoever what I'm talking about, and that they won't until they get married. Marriage is like pinch. If you want to describe pinch to somebody, you're going to have a hard time until they've felt it, right? And there's some things in life that are like that. Marriage is like that. And I don't say that in any way in disparagement. I just think it's true. I think it's part of human life that there's certain things in it that you cannot know until you have experienced them. And that when you experience them, that's when you say to yourself, aha, this is it. That's why. The second thing that's like that, which is part of marriage, of course, is having children. And it's one of the things, you think, for instance, how close a relationship can be with another human being. Then you get married and you realize that you're just discovering it, in a good and bad sense sometimes. You think that you know how much joy you can feel at the pleasure or pain of another person. And then you have children and realize that you never had this experience before. Things like that, which you stumble across in the course of marriage, which make you realize that it is a calling, right? It's a vocation in the sense that you are called to it. And I think in the end, called at the right moment by God. He sort of taps on your shoulder. And I can remember when I met my wife. And she actually came into the consulate in Bombay for a visa. And I managed to finagle an invitation to a dinner that her sister was giving over the weekend. And I and a fellow consular officer at the consulate there, we went to this dinner that her sister gave, just for a few friends and stuff. And on the way back, I was talking to my friend about this, and without really knowing why I said it, I looked at him and said, tonight I met the woman I'm going to marry. It was like that. And it was like God tapped me on the shoulder and he said, okay, this is it. And thereafter, it was actually, 2 years later or something before I proposed and anything like that. And most of that time I didn't even see my wife. But somehow or another, I had that intimation, right? That this was, as Tolstoy puts it in War and Peace somewhere, that was the night on which my fate was decided, right? And it turned out to be the case. So I think it is in a literal sense, it's a kind of calling. It doesn't always come to people, I don't think, in that literal way. But it does come to you that, oh, this is it. Okay. And you are either going to accept it, or, as many people are encouraged to do these days, because they're encouraged to be selfish and fearful, you can reject it. You can reject that call of marriage when it comes, and it might be there for you, and you can turn your back on it because you don't want to give up your pleasures, you don't want to give up your freedom, you don't want to have to work at a relationship with another human being, you don't want the responsibility, can't make the commitment, and so forth. So what God has prepared for you, you say, nope, don't want that, I'm going to go on with my dinner. Now if God is the chef, you might think about that. He might just cook better than you, but nonetheless, people prefer to eat what they cook themselves sometimes. But I do think that it's, in a true sense of the word, a calling. And the one who is calling you is the one who has plans for you, and that is your Creator. But also, it's a calling in the sense that it is a profession of faith. It's a profession of faith to be married. Faith in the end in a number of things. Faith in yourself, that you're actually going to be adequate to the task of fostering new life and doing it in a way that's responsible and not hurtful. It's also a profession of faith in the future. And I don't mean that in some abstract sense. I mean very concretely. It's a profession of faith that there is a future for your country, for the human race, for your community, that is going to have more in it of good than evil, that is therefore worth savoring, that it's a gift from God worth accepting. And in the end, of course, that means it's a profession of faith in God, that he did not institute human life and that he did not institute marriage to mock us and hurt us, but that they are here as things aimed at helping us to be who we're truly supposed to be, to realize our nature as he made it. And that there will be in that great joy. And that's a word that I use often now because I think we need to reintroduce it into the idea. These days we talk a lot about pleasure, we talk so little about joy. And yet there are joys in marriage life, there are joys in parenting that are way beyond pleasures, that you experience and you never realized that you could have an experience like that. And the only thing that it's like, I think, is it's very like those moments when you really feel your relationship with God. And I think in some ways your family life is part of that. It's part of, the ability. We don't all have the ability to be, I don't know, great saints and to experience the transports of spiritual ecstasy in our lives. So I think that God has given us an ordinary doorway to participate in what is, in a way, the essence of his creative being. That's why they call it procreation, I think, because it is our gift to share in his power of creation. And I think we can assume, can't we, that God had fun when he was making the world. Actually, I think that when I read the Genesis, that's how I look at it, God is kind of there, and first he performs the moon, and then he performs the sky, and he looks at his performance and he says, that was good. I enjoyed that. Let me do that again. There is joy in it. And I think we experience a part of that joy, a sense of that joy, even more than a glimpse, a real taste of it in family life. And I wish there were some way we could rekindle in people an understanding of that joy, because we've lost it. It used to be second nature in societies. People understood you want to have children, there's great joy in it. You want to have grandchildren, there will be a joy in it. And they longed for this, and they worked for it, and they kind of knew that there was a fulfillment coming. Along with other things, there's travail, there's grief, you get great joy from that family life. You also probably experience the greatest pains. But in some ways, what would life be if we weren't here to experience the things that God means us to be? And so through family life, as that kind of vocation and profession, we can have that experience. And in doing so, we are human, and yet we are lifted beyond our humanity to participate in God's work. And that's been kind of a hope, I think, for human beings. Think of it. The aim of life in so many different pagan religions and all that, what was it? It was apotheosis, right? That somehow you would do this or do that, some heroic action, some encounter with the God, and you would end up being raised to be a god, to have your constellation in the heavens, to be somehow divine. Well, I think what we understand, what I understand on the basis of my Christian faith, is that you are not raised to be divine. You are created with that truth of divinity within you. And what you have to be willing to do is turn to God and accept it. And the vocation of family is one way of showing that acceptance.
It sounds like to really experience this true joy, we need to respond to God's call. Other than that, our only other choices are perhaps the more base levels of pleasure and maybe happiness. But that's the world's call. Is that right?
Well, see, I wouldn't use the word happiness, though. Because I think that the true happiness is, in fact, answering God's call. And that one of the things that we've done wrong, in the Declaration of Independence, for instance, it refers to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I've heard that some people have objected to that, saying that it would have been better if they put something else in, because happiness makes it seem somehow as if you do whatever you want. But that's not true. Happiness, when you go back through the Christian tradition, even through the Western tradition, to Aristotle or somebody, happiness is a moral concept. Happiness is what you feel when you are good, basically, and all men desire it. They desire to be happy. That's what Aristotle says. Everybody wants to be happy. But the thing about it is, how are you going to understand that happiness? In our society, we're led to try to understand it without God, apart from our Creator, as if we are our own sort of source of happiness. But there is a transcendent understanding of happiness which sees it as acting according to your nature. And what is your nature? Your nature is the will of God in you, the will of God expressed in the particular act of His will that you represent. And your happiness comes when you are fulfilling that will for your time, for your moment, for your, sort of being that He has made. You are doing your best to be what He wants you to be.
What can someone expect if they don't follow God's will? If they don't say yes to God's call in their life? What's the outcome?
Well, I think it's fairly easy. I mean, you get lost is what happens. It's like what happens if you want to go somewhere and you lose your sense of direction. Oh, you're going to end up somewhere you don't want to go. And I think that that's what happens in life because God's call is like the polar star. Knowing which way is north is very important in determining directions, because by knowing which way is north, you kind of south and west and east, they all fall into place after that. If you lose sight of that, if you lose track of that, then of course you're going to wander around, you're going to get lost, you're going to fall into pits, you're going to be eaten by wild animals, you're going to end up in places that you had no intention of being, until you find your way again back to that sense of the right direction. So I think that's what happens. And I think we're living in a society that's filled with lost people. People who are lost, people who are wandering in a maze of confusion. They mistake sometimes transient moments of sensual satisfaction for happiness. And then they wake up and discover that didn't last. I actually feel worse now. How come? Well, because it's not part of anything. It's a little bit like taking the sort of heart out of something and leaving it to beat on the table. It is just going to die. Whereas in its proper place, performing its proper function, it becomes the source of life in a physical sense. And that, I think, is the way we are. We in our place, that is to say, in tune with that will which made us in the first place. We are like a note in harmony with the rest of the song. Taken out of that place, we can sing solo for a while, but it ends up, being kind of monotonous. And that's exactly what happens. I find it interesting that in our time, one of the great diseases of youth is boredom. Have you noticed that? Kids they're bored. I don't see how anybody could be bored in our time when you consider that most of the young people in our time have far more to distract themselves with than folks did 50, 60, 100 years ago, who were living in societies that didn't have anything like the internet, introduced to the vast, resources of the world. But all of this stuff is useless if you've lost touch with your sense of your own direction. For you after a while. And then it becomes monotonous. Oh yeah, I could do that, but what difference does it make? What does it matter? And that starts to eat away at your soul until it empties you out. You see, and that emptiness can destroy you, or that emptiness can finally open you up to the will of God that should, in fact, take its place. And that's where I think a lot of people are, not just young people, but young and old in our society. They reach that point where they have emptied themselves of truth by following all kinds of confusion. And that emptiness can either be a moment of great opportunity when, crushed under the weight of that emptiness, they finally open themselves to God, or it can be the moment that confirms their loss.
Is God's will the only thing that can fill that emptiness?
In the end, yes. I mean, because in a way that's a tautology, you see. When I say that, I mean to ask whether God's will is the only way to fill that emptiness is like saying, can we have being without God? And the answer to that question is obvious. Since it is impossible to conceive of being without God, you cannot truly have being if you turn your back on God. You see what I'm saying? And so, of course, in the end, no matter what we might think it is at first, if we find that satisfaction, it is because we have somehow reopened our connection with the presence of God in our lives.
Was there a point in your own life when you realized that God was real and had a purpose for your life? What was that like?
Oh, gosh, many points. I think one realizes this in different ways at different points in life. Partly because we stray, right? You wander off over here and so forth, and you wander off over there, and then you get back on track. But I'm trying to think. Obviously, one thing that really sticks in my mind in that regard is when my first child was born. And I think that was, for me, a very spiritually cathartic moment, or not moment, really, but experience, because it wasn't a momentary one. It grew over the course of time. So I think that was part of what I guess made me realize that the choice to marry is in fact a true profession. And I hadn't realized that necessarily, because I thought, oh, profession, that's what I was doing as a diplomat, and that's what I was doing as an academic. That was my profession. But I think that the birth of my first child made me realize, no, my profession is here. This is my profession. And I decided that when I made the marriage vows and made the child. We were accepting this profession. So I think that was very important. I think that the other important moment that happened within the last few years, when I decided that it was very important to commit myself to the pro-life movement, because it seemed to me that though it was the hardest question we were facing as a people, it was a question God was putting to us in a hard way because it was the most important question. And that I might be able to help. Because, even when I was young, I have been speaking a lot and, sort of able to do it in a way that seemed to make sense to people sometimes. And the point at which I realized that I should be using that gift in the service of the pro-life cause was also a point which required that I accept God's will for my life, because I wouldn't have thought of it that way necessarily. It certainly, in some ways, was not the easiest choice, especially if you're involved in public life and policy in America. Everything conspires to make other choices more attractive. And the point at which I realized I was, in fact, working in a job at Citizens Against Government Waste where I mostly talked about money issues. And you get very popular in America, you talk about money issues. Everybody wants to talk about money and saving money and taxes. And that's the kind of in thing to do in our political life. Talking about the moral issues is not. But more and more over time, I have realized that for Alan Keyes, in terms of how God has put together my life, I am either going to champion those issues or I'm going to be useless.
Sounds like God's call in your life is actually not just a once-only event, but a continual call, an unfolding, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. But it would have to be, because in various ways, everything that speaks to you in life speaks to you with the voice of God. We just don't always understand it. I would say that had to be the case if you really understood things, because in some sense or another, nothing happens in this world apart from His will. And if that's true, then we are continually called, because we are continually in the presence of His truth. It's just a matter that at certain times, I think, we are more prone to listen. And those are the moments when we think He's calling. No, He's calling all the time. There are just times when we're more prone to hear what He's got to say and to respond.
Sort of like a teaching moment.
Yeah. Yeah, but that moment is not a moment for God, it's a moment for us, if you see what I mean. You know, God is what he is. He is there. He is available. He is present all the time. There are just times when we are more attuned to accepting and receiving that presence as what it is. And that's one of the reasons, too, I think, that in the Catholic faith, we talk about the Holy Eucharist being very important, because I think it represents a kind of positive reminder, always in the context of our religious faith, of the reality of God's presence in our life and of the need to prepare ourselves to be open to that presence, to receive him on a continual basis.
What's the most important thing a young person can do to discover God's will in their life?
Well, that gets us back to the beginning, you know, because I think the most important thing you can do is to pray in the true sense of the word, which is not only about words that you speak. Prayer is actually a condition of your heart. And you can be in that condition without words. But if you are in that condition truly, then I think you are doing what you need to do. It's sort of like, in the scriptures, Christ often uses the metaphor of the bride and the bridegroom. And I think that my little memory of getting married, that prayer is like that moment when you are all prepared for the wedding. And that state of readiness, that state of anticipation, that openness to what is to come is a condition of prayer. Maybe that's why he used it so often, because in faith the readiness is all. And he calls us always to be in that state of readiness, which means he calls us always to be in a kind of prayerful condition. But that couldn't be the case, of course, if prayer means mouthing words, could it? No, so obviously it means something else. Prayer is a state of mind, it's a state of heart, it's a spiritual condition that we are called to be in, so that when, you know, that special moment of God's calling upon us manifests itself, we will be open to it.
What's at stake for a kid if he discerns rightly what the path of God is for his life?
Happiness. It's very simple. You're going to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy. Everybody in the society is promising happiness. There's only one who can deliver happiness, and he wants us to have it. So he's been real careful to lay out the terms and the conditions, and it's like somebody who wants you to have a good meal, so they very carefully write down the recipe. I'm going to be real careful about this, and if you do it the way I tell you, you are going to have delicious, delicious chicken cacciatore, but do it the way I tell you. You see? And very often we think, no, I'm not going to do it that way. You know, he says, put a little salt in here. I think I'll substitute something else. And then we come up and we taste the dish and we say, ugh, this isn't happy. I don't feel happy. How come? Well, you didn't follow the directions. And in that sense, we are even taught to resent the instructions, to treat them as if they were just, nasty constraints on what we want to do. When in point of fact, what we want to do is be happy. And if this is the way to do it, then what you want to do is right here. You don't really want to do all those things you think you want to do. What you want to do is follow the directions. And I think at some point in life, it takes time, mind you. And a matter of fact, I'd have to say, I think the word confess would be better. I certainly wouldn't pretend to be somebody who reads those instructions clearly every day. I wish I did. But I think that two things are important. One is to realize whose instructions they are, and the other to sincerely in your heart wish to achieve the goal. And at some point along the way, that combination of acknowledging God and really wanting the happiness that He can provide will help to correct our errors.